Okay, everybody, I'm sorry I couldn't make it to class today, but I hope that this video lecture will be nearly as good. Without any further ado, let's get on to the lecture. So in the first part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about evolution again. I'll recap the kind of central principle. I'll then look at why the evolution of cooperation is a problem. That is why cooperation is hard to evolve. And then I'll look at signaling theory in two parts, commitment signaling theory and charismatic signaling theory. We look at two different types of signaling theory because religion affects cooperation in different ways depending on the kind of cooperation problem that it is solving. Now, don't worry if these terms don't make a lot of sense to you, they will shortly. The key terms are cooperation and signaling. You'll remember that the central component of evolutionary theory is this idea of variation, inheritance, and some kind of constraint on population size. Where we have these conditions coming together, then blind mutations can favor adaptive designs that are good at promoting the fitness of replicators. We considered how evolution by natural selection can build biological designs, and we also looked at the argument from Richard Dawkins that natural selection on ideas can build ideas that are good replicators. Well, who cares about evolution by natural selection? That's biology. In this class, we're supposed to be looking at religion. I imagine some of you have been having that thought, and perhaps you're right. Perhaps this doesn't have much to do with religion. Now, that's not the argument of David Sloan Wilson. He's an evolutionary biologist at Binghamton, and he points to this passage in Darwin's diaries where Darwin describes the power of science generally to transform the obvious. And Darwin here is talking about geology, but the point applies to evolutionary biology, at least in principle. Darwin's talking about walking with his mentor, Sedgwick, in Cromwell Idwell, and examining all the rocks with extreme care. We were anxious to find fossils in them, but neither of us saw a trace of the wonderful glacial phenomena all around us. We did not notice the plainly scored rocks, the perched boulders, the lateral and terminal moraines. Yet these phenomena are so conspicuous that a house burnt by fire did not tell its story more plainly than did this valley. If it had still been filled by a glacier, the phenomena would have been less distinct than they are now. What an image! A house burnt by fire. And I think that's a very good image because you can imagine that if you're in a valley looking for fossils, you might not notice the extraordinary glacial features around you. You wouldn't notice that the rocks have been transported from somewhere else and that they're ripped to shreds by some force or another. Without the theory of glaciation, these features just might not strike you at all. Now, is there anything about religion that might be similar? That's the kind of key question we want to raise when we think about evolutionary biology. How does it give us new eyes to transform the obvious about religion? A popular saying that gets at the same idea is the concept of an elephant in the room. So we might want to ask ourselves, when thinking about religion, how does evolutionary biology enable us to see an elephant in the room that we might have missed otherwise? Now, in order to find the elephant in the room, again, remember we're going to be taking this very long view of human history. We're going to be thinking about what religion was doing for people in the deep and distant past, long before recorded history, when human beings were on a camping trip that never ended. How were people who were slightly more disposed to religion at an advantage over those who were less disposed to religion? Because this is a review, I can return to a previous example of what in the world is this instrument. Without an idea of the function of this instrument, we might not know what it's doing. I'll leave you for a few seconds to think about this question. Ah, yes, it was an avocado, what is it, slicer, I guess. And that thing at the very bottom removes the pit. Knowing the function, we understand the object and we can do something with it. Otherwise, it would have just been a puzzling tool. Right, what does this thing do? Any thoughts? Think about it. My father had one of these when I was growing up, which is how I thought of the example. And no, it's not a medieval torturing device. Aha! Now you know. Again, having an idea of what the function is, we immediately know what the design is, and we can begin to look at how an artifact works. Well, that's the kind of central idea of transforming the obvious. So before the break, we were talking about cultural evolution at the level of ideas and thinking about how it is that those ideas might evolve for their own interests instead of ours. But we know that the bulk of culture isn't like that. The bulk of culture that exists around us has evolved because it suits one or another purpose. Now, we're going to focus on the evolutionary problem of cooperation. And I'm first going to describe this problem, and after we get a good sense of why cooperation is difficult to evolve, we'll be in a better position to see what religion does to get us over the obstacles. Okay, imagine you are Bonnie or Clyde, and you and your counterpart have just robbed a bank, and the police have captured you, and they've isolated you from your partner, and they only have enough evidence to put you both away for a few years. So what they're trying to do is to get you to talk on the other. So here's the decision dilemma that you face. If you give state's evidence to the police on your partner, you will go free, and your partner will get 20 years in jail. On the other hand, if your partner gives state evidence on you and you don't say anything, then you will get 20 years in jail and your partner will go free. Now, if you both talk, you both go to jail for 15 years. So that's not very good. And if each of you remains to keep quiet, then both of you will get 1 year in prison each. So looked at from a kind of collective standpoint, you should both try to be quiet. The optimum outcome for both of you on average is to be quiet. Here's the deal. You could never do better than by giving state's evidence on your accomplice. So if your accomplice doesn't speak and you give state's evidence, well, hey, then you go free. And if your accomplice does speak and you give state's evidence, well, then you get 15 years in jail, which is a lot, but it's less than 20 years in jail. You can never do better in terms of time in prison than by, I think the mafia term is ratting on your fellow accomplice in crime. Now, it might not be in your interest if you're in the mafia to do that because the mafia will come after you. But we're imagining a simple case where they don't exist and your only problem is to minimize your time in jail. Well, here we can see that cooperation is an issue. If you could cooperate with your accomplice, you go a lot farther. But you can always do better by not cooperating. And for this reason, you both do worse. Aha, Babulia, enough of these toy examples. Nothing like this exists in real life, but so many problems like this exist in real life. For example, consider paying your taxes. You do much better to keep your money and not pay your taxes. Your income goes up by a factor of, what is it now, 30%. On the other hand, if no one pays their taxes, then society crashes to ruins. We don't have highways, we don't have hospitals, and heaven forbid we don't have universities that teach the evolution of religion. That's big trouble for society, isn't it? Additionally, perhaps the most important and deeply entrenched problem facing human beings today is how to deal with climate. Now, one way of dealing with climate is reducing carbon emissions. But if I give up my automobile and no one else does, well, the world doesn't change. On the other hand, if all of us were to give up our automobiles and our expensive air travel, well, then the world might have a chance. It would be in everyone's best interest to give the world a chance, but without intrinsically valuing the act of giving the world a chance, without seeing the journey as a kind of destination that we should value, we should be conservationists because it's right and good. If we're just thinking about our own best interests, well, even though we might do better if everyone were to coordinate in carbon emissions, in acting for our own self-interest, we would be unwise to pursue reduction of carbon emissions unilaterally. Now I'll come back to that point again later, because it's not clearly a prisoner's dilemma. Well, then everyone would be better off. But to get that benefit requires a coordinated effort. Aha, you say, Babulia, it's easy to solve this problem. We just hire some police. After all, that's what we do to get people to pay their taxes. We get them to fear being thrown in jail. Well, with police around, we can enforce a rule of law. And indeed, this is how human beings solve this cooperation problem. So what's the big deal? And why would we need religion here anyway? And I want you to think for a moment why the police aren't going to solve this problem. We can't appeal to police forces. Now, why is that? Think about it. The Roman playwright used the expression quis custodiet ipsos quid todos, which means, come on, you Latin scholars. Actually, I hope there aren't any Latin scholars here because I've clearly mangled Juvenal's Latin. Who will guard our guardians? That is, who will police us from the police? If you arm a bunch of people and you give them the authority to arrest and tax, well, why won't they pocket the money for themselves and make off with it? Why won't they defect? We can put this another way using our payoff matrix. We can look at the first order problem of punishing free riders or cheaters. We get the police involved, and this only creates a second order problem. The police might abuse their powers, or they might simply just be lazy and not go out and arrest people. After all, that requires effort. I'm defecting here. I've had enough of this lecturing. I'm going to go take a nap. Nice to defect, isn't it? Policing cooperation is the avocado. It's the cigar. It is the functional problem that we're going to consider religion as solving. And moving on to this, we're going to think about how it is that religion enables people to reliably cooperate with each other. Okay, the 4th century BCE Greek playwright Critias offered the following conjecture about how religion helps people to be cooperative. He imagines an original point in time when, quote, human lives were like the lives of beasts enslaved to force. There was no reward then. There was nothing for the good, nor was there punishment for the wicked. Critias imagines that some shrewd man first, a man in judgment wise, found for mortals the fear of gods, thereby to frighten the wicked, should they even act or speak or scheme in secret. Hence it was introduced the divine, so that everything which mortals say is heard, and everything done is visible. Even if you plan in silence some evil deed, it will not be hidden from the gods. A similar idea arises in Eastern thought. The Mosey talks about the awareness of ghosts and spirit, such that it is not possible to do something in the darkest places, whether in the wide marshes and mountains and forests and deep ravines, without the awareness of ghosts and spirit, certainly knowing of it. The punishments of the ghosts and the spirits are such that it is not possible to avoid them. So the idea is that where people are prone to believing in gods or ghosts that punish defection or cheating, well, then this can motivate people, even the police, to behave well. And in doing so, everyone's better off, at least if they all believe. For example, if Bonnie and Clyde believed that they would be better off by cooperating with each other because supernatural forces would punish them otherwise, then their beliefs cause them to behave in ways that make them better off. And in an evolutionary setting, we can imagine that people who have moralizing, punishing ghosts or spirits and gods in their world, or at least think they do, might be prone to behave better with each other. Are the cooperative benefits of moralizing and punishing gods the reason that religion became so prominent in human existence and has stayed with us for so long? That's the question I want to propose. It won't work, will it? Well, what's the problem? Why won't beliefs in gods or other kinds of supernatural police forces work to get us to become cooperative? Think about it for a moment. Now remember, this isn't a course in theology, and it's entirely possible that the gods exist and are rewarding and punishing people. I'm not going to ask that question in this course, but I am going to ask you to set your own belief aside and consider the beliefs in the ancient world, such as the belief in Zeus and other deities. Now, it's easy to suppose that Zeus isn't out there throwing lightning bolts at people. Then Zeus can't really change the payoff structure of defection. And over evolutionary time, people who are not disposed to believing in Zeus would be in the position of those who are able to get away with not paying their taxes. They'll simply go farther without the belief in Zeus. And if benefits translate into fitness, more offspring, well then we'd expect that the belief in Zeus would gradually be eliminated over evolutionary time, and dispositions to similar beliefs. When I started thinking about this question in the early 2000s, I came across a book by Zahavi. And in this book, there are descriptions of all sorts of puzzling behaviors that animals engage in, and the puzzling morphological features that look to be so dangerous, such as a peacock's elaborate coloration, which attracts predators. Zahavi proposed that these puzzling features are actually exquisite designs that make creatures more predictably cooperative. So let's first look at the case of the gazelle starting up and down. If we were able to go on safari to southern Africa, we would encounter springbok gazelle. What they do is, in the presence of the predator, they leap up and down in a way that makes them very obvious, and that also potentially exhausts them before a life or death chase. Now, why on earth would a springbok gazelle do anything so ridiculous? It's as if the gazelle is saying, "Hey buddy, over here, come eat me. I'm tiring myself out, so I won't be able to run away." Seems ridiculous. And yet that's what the springbok gazelle do in the presence of predators. Now, the interaction between predator and prey is not a zero-sum game. Remarkably, predator and prey have the opportunity to cooperate. And here's a good example of how evolution can transform the obvious. Consider, the dynamics between predator and prey are such that prey are always going to be just a little bit faster than predators. On average, that is. I mean, of course, some predators are going to get the prey, and that's how they're going to feed themselves. But if prey were always slower than predators, well, the predators would eat all the prey, and that would be it for both species. Now, when you think about it, the predators don't want to go around and chasing prey that they're never going to catch because the prey are too fast. Of course, the prey don't want to go around running from predators all the time. That's no good either. So if the two species could figure out a way of communicating who was fast and who was slow, well then both would be better off. Of course, species can't make this decision, but over evolutionary time, where there are signals that are effective at communicating speed between prey and predator, well, we can expect that these signals will be ratified. Now, the signals can't be simply, "Hey, I'm faster than you." That is, they can't be arbitrary strings of sound, because, well, then prey would always signal, "Hey, I'm faster than you," and there'd never be any reason to believe prey. What is needed is some kind of signals that is hard to fake, that only identifies, or at least on average only identifies, fast prey, and that isn't the sort of signal that could be produced by slow prey. Zahavi's point in the handicap principle is that leaping up and down and exhausting yourself in front of a dangerous life or death chase is exactly the kind of signal that would identify fitness. It's thumbing your nose in the face of a predator and saying, hey, you couldn't get me even if I could do this. There's energy, of course, jumping up and down, and there's some risk as well if the cheetah is hungry and decides to chase anyway, and, well, maybe the gazelle isn't fast enough. But those sorts of risks and energy expenses are, on average, less than just avoiding the chase. And so it came to pass that over time, animals that jumped up and down a bit and communicated their fitness in that way were favored and starting evolved as an adaptation. Cheetahs and springbok gazelle overcame their cooperation problem. Now, how do you know who your real friends are and who will come to your assistance when the chips are down? The cynic in me wants to say, you can't ever know. And that's true. We don't really know what's going to happen in the future, but we don't have to know with certainty who's going to come to our assistance. Just want to have a good guess. And there are cues that we use to assess people's commitments. One cue is how much time they're willing to spend with us. Another cue, and this comes out in the ritual of engagement, is how much of their pocketbook they're willing to spend on us. Are they going to buy me that diamond ring? Well, in smaller ways, will they buy me a coffee? And it's not just how they spend their money. Might not mean so much to the Trump family to spend a couple dollars on a coffee and wouldn't signal anything about their commitment. But if someone who doesn't have a lot of resource, time or money, spends that on me, well, yeah, I guess I can use the information. Of course, it might take a lot of time, a lot of coffees for me to figure out how I stand with someone else, but the information doesn't need to be perfect or instantaneous to be useful. Charles Darwin was very interested in emotional expressions. These are very hard to fake, it turns out. We understand this when we try to produce a smile for the camera. Many of us find it difficult, and that's because the muscles that orchestrate a smile are not controlled by our conscious brain. They're controlled by our emotional brain. So when we signal happiness or sadness or anger, it turns out to be a pretty reliable indicator of how we're motivated. Now that's quite interesting when you think about it, that an animal would evolve to show other animals what its motivations were, but that's happened in humans and many other lineages. Emotions are effective means of communicating our internal states, and they tend to be reliable and something we wear on our faces. Here again, the obvious is transformed. We take emotions for granted, and yet it might have never occurred to us why emotional expressions would have evolved to be so outward and so obvious to others around us. Well, that has happened because there is an interest in conveying our motivations honestly and accurately. It enables others to predict what we're going to do, and that can be mutually benefiting. To understand how religion solves the evolutionary problem of cooperation, we need to look at what religious people do, not just what they believe. Consider an extreme case to begin with. In Hinduism, there are religious ascetics called sadhus, and sadhus take vows of extreme self-impoverishment, and in some cases, self-mutilation. In the photos I'm depicting above, the sadhu is carrying a very large rock around his reproductive organ and is carrying around that rock on his reproductive organ for many years. I wouldn't advise doing this because it doesn't make your reproductive organ functional any longer. Or so I hear. I'm not going to try it. In any case, sadhus who do this are expressing an extreme cost. The act of piety is hardly insignificant and hardly comfortable. Now, if your flatmate or your brother or your lecturer were to do something that extreme, you might want to take them out for some fresh air or suggest they go on a holiday or perhaps put them in touch with some mental health counseling. You wouldn't think that that was normal or healthy. You certainly wouldn't think it'd be the kind of thing that would evolve on its own. People who do this to themselves can't have children anymore. In a religious setting or in the context of a religious culture, these kinds of acts are signs of piety. They signal a commitment to a moral order that is greater than ourselves and in which people can find meaning through cooperation. Now, it's unlikely that there's any specific gene that will be discovered for turning someone into a sadhu, like there's a gene for turning your hair color black or a gene for causing you to be tall. Nevertheless, the world over, people support their beliefs with actions. They conduct rituals. They sacrifice time, money, livestock, friendships, positions at work in order to pay respect to what they take to be sacred. Such actions would appear to be ridiculous in the absence of beliefs. Consider, suppose you're the kind of person that can't wait to get up in the morning on Sundays to get to church. Well, you have the motivation, you have the beliefs, you have reasons for being there. And if you're the kind of person who can't understand why someone would get up in the morning to go to church, well, then you can understand why it is that religious actions are signals. You don't do them unless you have the beliefs. Okay, well, let's look at how religious beliefs and religious rituals come together to overcome the evolutionary problem of cooperation. Well, if I believe in ghosts or spirits or karma or gods that reward cooperation, well, then I have a motivation to cooperate. And if you have those beliefs too, well, then we'll go farther together. Of course, this only creates a second-order defection problem because people who are uncooperative will seek us out and exploit us. What is needed is some sign or evidence that will identify those who really truly believe. We've seen how religious rituals can do this. You won't perform them unless you really believe. Now, if ritual actions are used as signals that communicate cooperative intentions, and the rituals are used as means for people to assort with one another. I seek people out who perform the rituals that I do because they have the beliefs that I do. Well, then that ritual system in combination with the belief system can form what Candace Alcorta calls an adaptive complex, an exquisite design for addressing the evolutionary problem of cooperation. Well, on the face of it, so to speak, the evidence for religious commitment signaling would appear to be compelling. People who don't share the same language and don't know each other do use religious ritual as a means of identifying who's trustworthy across ethno-linguistic lines. And religious emotions would look to be hard to fake. It's hard to express piety without feeling piety. Now, if you're a believer, this doesn't necessarily challenge your faith. It's not to say that a God didn't create the universe and evolve it in such a way that made religion a source of commitment between people. And if you're a disbeliever, well, here you go. Here's an evolutionary explanation for religion that doesn't claim that religious ideas are parasites of the mind. It's an alternative view for you. I don't think any of this needs to tilt our belief in God one way or another. What it does do is expose exquisite adaptive functionality that we might not have got to by other means. It shows us a kind of elephant in the room about how religion is supporting social connection and sacrifice for each other. Okay, so this system works when people are able to observe each other's expressions and actions. Good enough, but how does cooperation scale up? After all, we cooperate with people that we don't even know. Think about the orange juice you drank this morning. You don't know who made it, and pretty much everything we enjoy is that way. Now, all of that needed to happen. Systems needed to evolve to facilitate cooperation among strangers. Well, the last part of this rather lengthy and theoretically heavy discussion focuses on signaling at large social scales. And I call this kind of signaling charismatic signaling. Now, we begin with this observation that not all cooperation problems are threatened by cheating. The philosopher David Hume imagines two neighbors who are trying to drain a meadow. Well, it's easy for them to agree, but imagine you had to get a whole bunch of neighbors together to drain a meadow. Well, that's going to be very difficult because it requires everyone predicting that everyone else will cooperate. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau imagines a hunting party in which everyone is out chasing a stag. Well, everyone would do better if they just persisted in chasing a stag, but to get it requires that everyone works together. And in this kind of case, we might be tempted to opt for a lower paying, yet certain benefit. Rousseau imagines chasing a rabbit. But we might just want to go for the risk-free, lower paying option, simply because we wish to avoid risk. That's not cheating, we just want to cover our bases. Okay, well, I made another matrix so that you could see that there are two equilibriums here. One that is unstable. Yeah, we can do no better when all cooperate, and that's an equilibrium. And the other is stable. I can do no better when you defect, and likewise, you can do no better when I defect. Now, if your head is spinning, don't worry too much about it. I'll go over this stuff again in class. And I think these concepts are difficult. But the key idea is that where cooperation is threatened by risk, if you evolve mechanisms that coordinate people's motivations, get them not to even think about risks, well, those sorts of systems will tend to evolve solutions to these large-scale coordination problems. And indeed, when we look to civilizations at the beginning of the modern urban period, we see massive theater complexes devoted to the gods, which were mechanisms for aligning people's beliefs and motivations in such a way that they just assumed not only that they believed in the cosmic order, but that everyone around them did too. And for this reason, these theater complexes enabled people to be predictably cooperative. Or so charismatic signaling claims. I think we need to look at some evidence at this stage because this lecture has been very theoretical, and without evidence to sink our teeth into, I think that it's going to just remain abstract. So in part 2 of this lecture, we're going to look at 2 experiments that support commitment and charismatic signaling. So stay tuned. So the first study is the first experiment I ever did as an academic, and that was with my former PhD student, Andrew Mahoney. And we looked at how it was that religious and non-religious people responded to costly acts of religious partners, or in the case of the control, secular partners. In the religion condition, Andrew wrote a program, so it appeared that people were interacting with someone they took to be a fellow Christian, and we recruited only Christians. Here's how the study worked. We gave our Christian participants, who were real, $5, and we told them that they were interacting with another fictitious Christian partner who was starting the game with $0. And through this clever design, it seemed as if the other player was told that they were interacting with someone who was not a Christian. And the message came back through the program to our real participant that the Christian on the other side accepted $0 for the reason that that person is not a Christian. So in theory, that person on the other side was undertaking a costly act to avoid interaction with someone who is not a member of their religion. Although our Christian participant received nothing in this game, they still had the ability to give any amount of money between $0 and up to the $5 that they'd received for participating. And so that was the question, do you give any back? Now, of course, in the second condition, the player that we recruited, the real player, was given $5 and told that they were playing an Aucklander who refused to give any money back or cooperate because on the other end, they believed themselves to be playing with a Wellingtonian. And in this condition, which was formally similar, we looked exactly the same kind of question. How much money would our focal participant give back to an Aucklander who refused to play with someone because they were from Wellington? It's evident from the graph that the frequency of giving the full amount to the opponent was much higher among Christians, whereas in the case of giving money back to the Aucklander who was refusing to pay with an outgroup member, we saw very little donation in that condition. Well, this suggests that, yeah, religious identification and costly signals which support religious identification do lead to greater cooperation. Well, I'll leave it until the next time we meet to discuss this result and some of the others in your readings, and I'll be curious to know what you think about it. The second study I want to talk about looks at how religious rituals that involve a high cost component, in this case a high pain component, tend to make people cooperative in very large settings where we can't really observe each and every person around us. Do rituals that involve high costs support cooperation in anonymous settings? So this takes us to the island nation of Mauritius, which is one of the most diverse societies in the world with significant ethnic, linguistic, and religious differences. Now, there are also plenty of rituals here, and I'm going to talk about Thai Pusam, which is a ritual that is performed by the Hindu majority on this island, who are Tamil Hindus. And it's a ritual that's one of the most intense of anywhere in the world. It arrived to Mauritius between 1834 and 1921 during waves of Indian migrant movements to the island. Now, Thai Pusam on Mauritius involves extreme, with people piercing themselves with, in some cases, large poles, and carrying heavy altars on their backs around the streets in the searing hot heat, and more generally over a period of days praying and fasting, and by all appearances to outsiders making life difficult for themselves. To study people in their natural environments means that you can't manipulate them like you would in an experiment. Quite the opposite, you must respect their beliefs and practices. We compared people from the same general ritual in two conditions. Now, Thai Pusam takes place over 10 days, and in one condition, we focused on people who were praying and chanting and singing. And in another condition, we focused on two groups. One that was piercing themselves and carrying altars, and another in that same condition that was observing them. So we hypothesized, based on signaling theory, that in the low condition, we would find less charity to other people than in the high condition. And by low, I mean low intensity or low pain, and high, I mean high intensity and high pain. So we also measured people's commitments to their group, and we hypothesized that people would have a greater in-group commitment in the high-intensity ritual as compared with the low-intensity ritual. To measure charity, we obtained 1,200 coins of 20 rupees each, which was approximately 2 days' salary for an unskilled worker on Mauritius. We asked participants questions about their religious commitment and their prior involvements with Thai Pusam. And at the end of the survey, we gave them the 20 rupees, and we emphasized that the money was theirs to keep. It wasn't ours. Now, on the way out of the experiment, we offered them the opportunity to give money back to the temple because we said, quite accurately, that people sometimes don't want to take money for participating in an experiment. And if they wanted to give money back, they could do so in an anonymous way. And it was a dark area that was private. But what we did was we matched each survey response to a postcode on the envelope. And in this way, we could track participant responses and link responses to the demographic questionnaire with the amount of charity that was donated in the envelope. I like this because the responses really were anonymous. We couldn't tell who the individuals themselves were. And also, we didn't need to use any deception. We just simply kept track of donations using the postcode. Now, if you ask someone their identity in Mauritius, you're always going to get the top of the scale. People just don't know or don't think of themselves as being anything but maximally identified. So in order to try to get at some measure of identity, we forced a choice between two types of identity. And to select which you felt most closely identified with, you had to press a number bar, or rather a space bar on a computer, and the number of times you press the space bar in a particular direction would move a cursor to one side or another. And this was our attempt to get at relative identity between what we took to be the two dominant interests, that of being connected to the nation and that of being connected to the religion. In the low arousal condition, we had 34 participants. Now, there weren't observers or participants. It was just everyone or anyone could have been sampled to respond from the condition, which involved music and dance and singing and prayer, but no body mutilation and no physical ordeal. Here are some images from the event.
బొమ్మ బొమ్మ తాతయ్య తయ్యన కుదిన కున కుదిన్ భజన్ కరే బొమ్మ బొమ్మ తాతయ్య తయ్యన కుదిన కున కుదిన్ భజన్ కరే ఉదని దనది మిదితాం దితాం తోం తై తై గణపతి నాం సదా బొమ్మ బొమ్మ తాతయ్య తయ్యన కుదిన కున కుదిన్ భజన్
Here's my postdoc who was absolutely starving and finally got a meal. We also had a higher ordeal ritual, and we had 19 participants who were piercing themselves and carrying altars around, and 32 observers.
ಅವರು ವಾಸುಗೆ ತರಂಬಾಗಿದೆ ಅಗೆ ನಾಮ ಸತ್ತು ಗಣರಾಜ ಅವರು ವಾಸುಗೆ ತರಂಬಾಗಿದೆ ಅಗೆ ನಾಮ ಸತ್ತು ಗಣರಾಜ ತಾಳ ಮಂದಿರ ಬಹು ನಾಮ ಸತ್ಸುರ ಮಂಡಲ ಕಿ ಸುರಬಾಜ ತಾಳ ಮಂದಿರ ಬಹು ನಾಮ ಸತ್ಸುರ ಮಂಡಲ ಕಿ ಸುರಬಾಜ ದಿಮ್ಮಿತ್ರಿಗಡ ದಿತ್ತಿ ತಾಳ ದಿತ್ತಿ ಕಿಟ್ಟ ತಾಗರದ ತಾಳತ ಓಡುದ दिमिदितां दितां दौं तै तै गणपतिनां सदा वेणुवासरे तರಂಬಾಗಿದೆ ದ್ರಿಮಿ 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 ಮಿರುದಂಗ ಅಬರು ವಾಸುಗೆ ತರಂಬಾಗಿದೆ ದ್ರಿಮಿ 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 ಮಿರುದಂಗ ನವಾಬ್ ಸಾರಂಗ ಸಿತಾರ ಕಿನ್ನರಿ ಅವರು ವಾಸುವೈ ಮುಖ ಸಿಂಗ ನವಾಬ್ ಸಾರಂಗ ಸಿತಾರ ಕಿನ್ನರಿ ಅವರು ವಾಸುವೈ ಮುಖ ಸಿಂಗ ದಿಮ್ಮಿತ್ತಿರಗಿಡ ದಿತ್ತಾಳ ದಿತ್ತಿ ಕಿಟ್ಟ ತಾಗರದ ತಾಳದ ಓಡುದ ದಿಮ್ಮಿತ್ತಿರಗಿಡ ದಿತ್ತಿ ತಾಳ ದಿತ್ತಿ ಕಿಟ್ಟ ತಾಗರದ ತಾಳದ ಓಡುದ ಉದನಿದ ನದ್ರ ದಿಮಿದಿತಾಂ ದಿತಾಂ ದೌಂ ತೈ ತೈ ಗಣಪತಿನಾಂ ಸದಾ ಉದನಿದ ನದ್ರ ದಿಮಿದಿತಾಂ ದಿತಾಂ ದೌಂ ತೈ ತೈ ಗಣಪತಿನಾಂ ಸದಾ ಅವರು ವಾಸುಗೆ ಕರಂಬಾಗಿದೆ ದ್ರಿಮಿ 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 ಮಿರುದಂಗ ನವಾಬ್ ಸಾರಗ ಸಿತಾರ ಕಿನ್ನರಿ ಅವರು ವಾಸುವೈ ಮುಖ ಸಿಂಗ ದಿಮ್ಮಿತ್ತಿರಗಿಡ ದಿತ್ತಾಳ ದಿತ್ತಿ ಕಿಟ್ಟ ತಾಗರದ ತಾಳದ ಓಡುದ ಉದನಿದ ನದ್ರ ದಿಮಿದಿತಾಂ ದಿತಾಂ ದೌಂ ತೈ ತೈ ಗಣಪತಿನಾಂ ಸದಾ ವೇಣುವಾಸರೆ ಅಮೃತ ಕುಂಡಲಿಕೆ ತಾರಿ ತಿರುಗಿದ ವಾತಜ ವೇಣುವಾಸರೆ ಅಮೃತ ಕುಂಡಲಿಕೆ ತಾರಿ ತಿರುಗಿದ ವಾತಜ ನವಾಬ ಸಾರಂಗ ಸಿತಾರ ಕಿನ್ನರಿ ಅವರು ವಾಸುವೈ ಮುಖ ಸಿಂಗ ನವಾಬ ಸಾರಂಗ ಸಿತಾರ ಕಿನ್ನರಿ ಅವರು ವಾಸುವೈ ಮುಖ ಸಿಂಗ ದಿಮ್ಮಿತ್ತಿರಗಿಡ ದಿತ್ತಾಳ ದಿತ್ತಿ ಕಿಟ್ಟ ತಾಗರದ ತಾಳದ ಓಡುದ ದಿಮ್ಮಿತ್ತಿರಗಿಡ ದಿತ್ತಿ ತಾಳ ದಿತ್ತಿ ಕಿಟ್ಟ ತಾಗರದ ತಾಳದ ಓಡುದ
Okay, time for the results. Well, in the low arousal ritual, people gave somewhere under half of the total amount that they could have given back in charity. In the high arousal ritual, there was substantially more giving, about twice as much giving among observers. And somewhat less than the observers were the performers, who were giving more than participants in the low arousal ritual, but not quite so much as those who were observing. We'll come back to that in a moment. We also found that the perception of pain in the ritual was correlated with the amount of giving. So people who perceived the ritual to be more painful tended to give more than those who perceived it to be less painful. Why would pain be associated with more giving? Well, we think it has to do with the enactment of charity in the ritual itself, the giving of food and ashes and water, and of course, the undertaking of a very painful ritual ordeal on behalf of the community and its sacred values. All of that is rehearsing giving to one another. And in this context of open giving, well, we see that people respond by being charitable themselves.
भजन करे उदन निदन दिमिदितां दितां दौं तै तै गणपतिनां सदा उदन निदन दिमिदितां दितां दौं तै तै गणपतिनां बम्म बम्म दा तैय तैय.
What about identity? Well, this sort of surprised us because in the low arousal ritual, we found that people, instead of having parochial identities, were more identified with Mauritius, which is the nation. Well, this surprised us also. In the high pain ritual, we found that the observers were also more inclined to a Mauritian identity than they were to a Hindu identity, and that the performers were about twice as inclined to a Mauritian identity than a Hindu identity. Well, why would that be the case? Well, it turns out that Mauritius is the superordinate or the large and overarching binding group identity on this island. So Mauritian Hindus see themselves as bound up as part of a larger community that must get along. And it's a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, and multi-religious community. And this shows the power of these ancient rituals to capacitate social bonding even in societies that are culturally and religiously diverse. Hey, folks, that's it for this lecture today, and I'm going to leave you with a bit of music, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. And thanks for bearing with me as I present my lecture in a very different format. I hope this is okay, and uh, if it's not, no worries. I'll be back to answer questions next week.
गणपति नाम सदा बम्म बम्म ता तैय तैय नकु दिनाकु नकु दिन भजन करे बम्म बम्म ता तैय तैय नकु दिनाकु दिन भजन करे उदन निदन दिल दिमि दिताम दिताम तुम तैय तैय गणपति नाम सदा उदन निदन दिल दिमि दिताम दिताम तुम तैय तैय गणपति नाम बम्म बम्म ता तैय तैय गणपति नाम सदा बम्म बम्म ता तैय तैय नकु दिनाकु दिन भजन करे बम्म बम्म ता तैय तैय नकु दिनाकु दिन भजन करे उदन निदन दिल दिमि दिताम दिताम तुम तैय तैय गणपति नाम सदा उदन निदन दिल दिमि दिताम दिताम तुम तैय तैय गणपति नाम बम्म बम्म ता तैय तैय नकु दिन भजन करे उदन निदन दिल दिमि दिताम दिताम तुम तैय तैय गणपति नाम सदा दिमि तिरगड़ दिति तड़ दिति किट तगड़ तगड़ ओडुगा दिमि तिरगड़ दिति तड़ दिति किट तगड़ तगड़ ओडुगा उदन निदन दिल दिमि दिताम दिताम तुम तैय तैय गणपति नाम सदा बम्म बम्म ता तैय तैय नकु दिन भजन करे उदन निदन दिल दिमि दिताम दिताम तुम तैय तैय गणपति नाम सदा तारी तिरगड़ दिमि तिरगड़ दिति तड़ तगड़ तगड़